Two cruisers cut across the parking lot exit before Mark Jensen's car door had even swung shut, boxing him
Hands
in.
where I can see
Officers
him.
were out and moving
Right
fast.
now.
Hands where I can
Step
see
away
them.
from the car.
His daughter's fingers dug into his palm
Now.
hard enough to hurt, and behind the officers, a voice he recognized was already calling out his name. Flat, certain, already sure of what it wanted the police to believe. He didn't know yet how the next 10 minutes would end, or that the woman who'd made the call had planned it exactly this way. This story is a dramatization. The names, the company, none of it real. What it's built from is. 3 weeks before that Friday, none of it looked like it was building toward anything. Sterling Corp had the kind of lobby that photographed well for the careers page. Exposed brick, a wall of plants nobody watered, a barista station that went quiet after 10. Mark had worked inside it for 5 years, long enough to know the distance between how the place looked and how it actually ran. He was 38, a senior analyst, the guy who found the number that didn't add up before anyone else noticed there was a number to find. He'd been raising his daughter Lily alone since his wife died 3 years back, and the job wasn't just income. It was the floor everything else stood on. He got in early. He kept his inbox clean. He didn't take long lunches, not because a policy said so, but because he'd learned, the way you learn weather patterns, that the room gave him less margin than it gave other people, and he'd rather not find out exactly how much less. His manager, Amanda Henderson, had climbed the ladder by reading rooms better than she read spreadsheets. She was sharp about optics and thin on substance, which had worked fine for her right up until she got a direct report who kept finding the parts of her work that didn't hold together. It started small, the way these things do. She'd walk his findings into a leadership meeting and present them as her own thinking, and he'd sit there deciding, again, whether it was worth the fight. It never felt worth the fight. Then it got personal in the deniable way. "If only we could all communicate as clearly as Mark," she said once, mid-meeting, smiling the whole time, and 6 people in the room went quiet in the specific way people go quiet when they've heard something ugly and aren't sure they're allowed to say so. He didn't complain. He adjusted. He got better at being unremarkable in rooms where remarkable had already cost him something. The Tuesday it really landed for him was a leadership review, 12 people around a table, half of them on a screen. Mark had spent his weekend building a churn analysis explaining, cleanly, why the West region's numbers had cratered. A shipping partner quietly missing deadlines for 3 straight months. He'd sent the deck to Henderson Sunday night so she could loop it into her update. She stood and walked the room through his findings without once saying his name. "So what my team identified," she said, clicking to his slide, his chart, his footnotes, "is a fulfillment issue we caught early. Someone on the video call said, 'Great work, Amanda.' She said thank you like she'd earned it. Mark sat 3 seats down and said nothing, because saying something in that room would have cost him a fight he had no evidence-free way of winning. His word against a VP who was already halfway convinced the work belonged to her. Afterward, at the elevator, Henderson caught up to him, bright and casual. "Great numbers, by the way. Really tight work." She said it like a compliment. It took him a full floor to realize it was closer to a warning. "I know exactly whose work that was, and I did it anyway, and there's nothing you're going to do about it." Then he found the invoices. It was a Tuesday night, late, the office down to the hum of the HVAC and one other person 3 rows over. He was reconciling a vendor contract that kept creeping upward every quarter, line items too vague to mean anything, dollar amounts that didn't track to any deliverable he could find, and every authorization on every one of them traced back to the same signature. Henderson's. He sat with that for a long time before he did anything about it. Not because he doubted what he was looking at, the pattern was too clean to be anything but deliberate, but because he understood immediately and completely what it would cost him to say so out loud. A black man accusing his white manager of financial fraud, with nothing yet but numbers on a screen, was not a story that got to control how it was told. So he built a file instead. Screenshots, dates, dollar amounts, time-stamped and backed up to a drive Henderson didn't know existed. He told himself he'd take it to the board once it was airtight. He didn't tell himself what he'd do if he never felt like it was airtight enough. Henderson found out he was looking 3 days later. From an IT request he hadn't been careful enough to hide. She didn't confront him. She went home, poured a drink she didn't finish, and sat at her kitchen table doing math that had nothing to do with spreadsheets. How many years she had left before this exact thing caught up with her. How much of her mortgage was riding on nobody ever asking the question Mark was clearly about to ask. She told herself this wasn't cruelty. It was containment. If she said that to herself enough times, maybe it would stop needing to be said. Firing him outright was too clean a trail. A 5-year employee with a spotless record doesn't get walked out without somebody in HR asking why, and an HR review was the last thing she could survive right now. She needed something that didn't have her fingerprints on it. Something the police would finish for her. Mark, for his part, had already started protecting himself in smaller ways. A few weeks earlier, after a meeting where something he'd said got repeated back to him twisted just enough to be unrecognizable, he'd bought a pen. Not a spy movie prop, a legitimate, boring little device that happened to record audio, the kind of thing that shows up if you search, "How do I protect myself at work at 11 at night?" He'd looked up the law for his state before he ever clicked it on. One-party consent, meaning he only needed his own permission to record a conversation he was part of. Carrying it felt faintly ridiculous. He carried it anyway. He mentioned the invoices once carefully to Priya Nazir, a friend from the audit team who'd been at Sterling almost as long as he had. They were in the stairwell, the one place in the building nobody used, which was exactly why they used it. "If it's what you think it is," Priya said, arms crossed. "You don't sit on it. You know that, right?" "I know that." He rubbed his eyes. "I also know what happens if I take it up the chain and I'm wrong. Or if I'm right and it still doesn't matter because it's my word against her signature, and everybody in that room already has an opinion about which one of us to believe." Priya didn't argue with that, which told him more than if she had. "Then don't go in without something that isn't just your word," she said. "Get it airtight first. Then go over her head. Not through her." It was more or less the plan he'd already landed on. Hearing someone else say it out loud just made it feel less like paranoia and more like strategy, which, in hindsight, was exactly the distinction that was about to matter. The following Friday, Henderson made her move. She'd pulled a tablet from a review unit nobody was tracking closely. New enough to matter, common enough that its absence wouldn't trip an inventory alert for days. Around 4, she watched Mark head to the break room, bag unzipped on the back of his chair. She crossed to the next cubicle like she was stopping to chat, and in the half-second nobody was looking, she slid the tablet under a binder in his bag. It took less time than it takes to say it did. An hour later, as the floor was thinning out for the weekend, she came to find him packing up. "Mark, got a second?" Her voice was pitched just a little too loud, aimed less at him than at the two people still at their desks. "We've got a problem. One of the prototype tablets is missing." He looked up, already feeling something drop in his stomach before he understood why. "Okay, did you check the sign-out sheet?" "We checked everything." She said it flat, like a closing argument. "Security's got you logged near the supply closet this afternoon." "I went in for staples, Amanda. That's the whole story. It's a $1,000 piece of company equipment. It doesn't walk off on its own." Her eyes flicked, just once, toward the two co-workers still in earshot, and Mark clocked it, the audience she was building. Then softer, worse. "You've seemed off lately, distant. I hope things are okay at home, with everything you've got going on." He didn't answer that. There wasn't a version of an answer that didn't sound, on the record, like exactly what she wanted it to sound like. "I'm calling the police," she said, phone already out, already turning to walk away like the conversation had reached its natural end. His hand had drifted to his shirt pocket sometime in the last 30 seconds. He didn't remember deciding to click the pen on. It had become a reflex around her months ago, the way you flinch before you register the sound. 10 minutes later he was in his car, driving to get Lily, and the 10 minutes felt like both nothing and an hour. He wasn't thinking in full sentences. He was thinking in fragments. Get her, get home, figure out the rest from there. She barreled into him the second she saw him through the glass doors. Already mid-sentence about pizza. Extra pineapple, could they, please? He said yes to all of it and kept his voice light and didn't manage to feel any of the lightness underneath it. They made it as far as the parking lot. 2 cruisers cut across the entrance, lights already going, and Mark's stomach dropped somewhere below the pavement. 2 officers came out fast. A man, Davies, built like the job had made him that way, and a woman, Miller, younger, scanning the scene like she was still deciding what it was. Henderson stood a few feet behind them, and the moment his door was open, she was pointing. That's him. He's got the tablet. It's in his bag. I saw it. Sir. Hands where I can see them. Davies didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His hand was already resting near his belt, and something about the stillness of it was louder than shouting would have been. Mark stepped in front of Lily without deciding to. Officers, there's been a mistake. I work with that woman. This is a workplace thing. We'll sort out what it is. Will you consent to a search of the bag? No. He kept it level, deliberately level, the way he'd trained his whole life to sound calm in rooms where calm was the only thing he got to control. You don't have my consent to search anything. He watched it land wrong. Davies's jaw shifted, some internal decision finalizing behind his eyes, and Mark understood, with a sick, sinking clarity, that declining had somehow become its own kind of evidence. Shouldn't have. It did. Sir. Based on the complainant's identification, we've got reason to believe. She planted it, Mark said, too fast, too close to pleading, and hated himself a little for how it sounded even as he said it. Ask her how she knew exactly where to look. Ask her that. Nobody asked her that. Davies pulled the bag off his shoulder. Miller stood close, watching Mark's hands more than she was watching Henderson's face. And when the tablet came out from under the binder, something in both officers' postures relaxed. Not because the picture made more sense, but because it now matched the one they'd already built. Miller's eyes flicked to Lily once. Just once. Something crossing her face that looked almost like doubt before it disappeared back under procedure. Turn around. Hands behind your back. Please. His voice broke on it, finally, all the way through the calm. Not in front of her. She's 7. Can we just... 5 minutes, can we talk? There was no version of the next 30 seconds that spared Lily anything. The cuffs closed with a sound too small for what it did to her. She started screaming before he'd even finished turning around, and a woman from social services, already parked, already briefed, already prepared for exactly this configuration of a Friday, stepped in to take her hand. Lily fought it with her whole small body, reaching for him, and Mark twisted his head to find her face one more time before a hand on his shoulder folded him into the back of the cruiser. It's going to be okay, baby. Daddy loves you. This is a mistake. I promise you. The door shut on the rest of the sentence. From the curb, Henderson watched them pull away. She didn't smile exactly. Her arms were crossed too tight across her chest, and if anyone had looked closely they might have noticed her hands weren't entirely steady. Not guilt yet, not quite, more like the specific electric aftermath of having done something you can't undo and are already starting to feel the size of. But nobody was looking closely. She'd made sure of that. The interrogation room smelled like every interrogation room does. Old coffee, cold air, a fluorescent tube humming just slightly out of rhythm with itself. Mark sat with his wrists raw from cuffs. He could still feel, even with them off, and thought about nothing except whether anyone had told Lily he was coming back. Davies and Miller came in loose, unhurried, the posture of two people who consider the hard part already finished. "All right, Mr. Jensen." Davies pulled out the chair across from him, didn't sit so much as settle into it. "We found the tablet in your bag. Your boss ID'd you on scene. Sooner you talk to us, sooner this goes easier." Mark looked at him for a long moment. "I want a lawyer," he said. "I'm not saying anything else until I have one." It didn't go easier. It went quiet. Davies trying 2 more angles, Miller watching from the wall with an expression Mark couldn't read, and Mark saying nothing at all, holding the silence like it was the only thing left he had control over. An hour later, a public defender named Sarah Collins walked in, coat still on, already reading the room before she'd finished crossing it. She had the officers cleared out inside of a minute and sat down across from him. "Tell me everything," she said. "Don't skip anything, even the parts that feel irrelevant. Especially those." He told her. The invoices, the file on the drive, months of small, deniable cruelty that had never once been bad enough on its own to report. The tablet appearing in his bag out of nowhere, on the one Friday it mattered most. When he got to the part where it was his word against hers, he ran out of momentum and just sat there, hollowed out. "The physical evidence is a real problem," Sarah said. She didn't soften it, and he was grateful in some distant way that she didn't. Anything at all that shows motive? That shows she had a reason to come after you specifically." And that's when he remembered. The pen. His voice came back fast, almost too fast. "In my jacket pocket. It records, it's legal, I checked, my state's one-party consent. I only needed my own permission. I have the whole conversation. Her calling security. The thing she said about my house. All of it." Something shifted behind Sarah's eyes. Not quite a smile. Something more careful than that. Like she didn't want to spend the hope until she'd confirmed it was real. "Get me the property officer. Now." They brought his jacket back in a paper bag. She unscrewed the pen, found the drive, plugged it into her laptop, and had Davies, Miller, and their sergeant called back into the room before she hit play. Henderson's voice filled the small space first. Measured, then needling, then the line about his house, delivered soft enough to sound like concern and mean enough to be neither. Then Mark, calm, denying it, asking her to check his desk. Then the call to the police, her voice performing distress for an audience that, at the time, hadn't yet realized it was one. Nobody spoke when it ended. Miller was looking at the tablet on the table like it had physically changed shape in front of her. Davies wasn't looking at anyone. The sergeant exhaled slow through his nose, the sound of a man doing arithmetic on exactly how bad the rest of his week had just become. "You arrested my client," Sarah said into the silence. In front of his 7-year-old daughter, on the word of a woman who is now on tape engineering the entire event. "I'd like to hear what happens next." What happened next took 3 more hours. The DA's office, paperwork, the particular slowness of a system that had moved so fast to close around him now grinding, just as inefficiently, toward letting him go. When the cell door finally opened, there was no apology. Just, "Charges declined. You're free to go." They handed back his wallet, his keys, the pen. He called social services with his hands shaking too hard to hold the phone steady, and drove straight to the emergency placement where Lily had spent the last several hours with strangers. She came apart the second she saw him in the doorway. Not relief exactly, something rawer than that, something that had been holding itself together purely because it had no other choice. And he sat down on the front steps of a house he'd never see again and held her while she cried herself quiet, telling her over and over that it was over, that he wasn't going anywhere, that he was sorry, so sorry, for all of it. The next morning, 2 detectives who weren't Davies or Miller walked into Sterling Corporation. Not for a statement this time. Henderson was at her desk when they found her, coffee going cold beside her keyboard, already 3 emails deep into pretending Friday hadn't happened. She looked up and, for 1 full second, her face did nothing at all. A blankness so complete it looked almost peaceful, like her mind hadn't caught up to what her eyes were seeing. Then it caught up all at once. This is a misunderstanding, I can explain. The words came out too fast, stacking on top of each other, none of them landing anywhere near steady. Her hands went to the edge of her desk like she needed something solid to hold. When they said the words false report and obstruction, something in her face didn't so much fall as give out, the way a structure gives out once the load-bearing lie underneath it is gone. She didn't cry. She looked, more than anything, like someone watching a version of herself she'd never quite believed would show up. They walked her out past the desks she used to walk past on her way to meetings where she took other people's work and called it hers. Nobody said anything. Nobody had to. In the weeks that followed, Sterling Corp's internal investigation confirmed everything the invoices had been quietly insisting for months. A kickback arrangement with a vendor, running for years, siphoning money in amounts small enough to survive a casual audit and large enough over time to matter a great deal. Framing Mark hadn't really been about the tablet or even about him specifically. It had been about buying enough time and enough doubt that nobody would believe him before she could bury the rest of it. That didn't undo the Friday. Mark kept living inside it in small ways. The sound the cuffs made, the specific stranger's face that had taken Lily's hand. A few weeks later, with Sarah Collins beside him, he filed a federal civil rights suit against the city and against Davies and Miller by name under a statute called Section 1983. A law that lets ordinary people sue government officials who violate their constitutional rights while acting under the color of law. The city's lawyers reached for the standard shield, qualified immunity, the doctrine that protects officers unless they violated a right so clearly established that any reasonable officer in their position would have known better. Their argument was straightforward. An accuser on scene, evidence physically recovered from the bag, a suspect who declined a search. Reasonable enough, they said, on its face. Sarah's answer, in a deposition room 3 months later, was just as straightforward. An accusation from someone with an obvious motive isn't evidence, she said, leaning forward slightly, letting the silence after it do some of the work. It's a reason to investigate, not a substitute for investigating. Nobody asked Ms. Henderson a single follow-up question before they put a father in handcuffs in front of his own child. If that's reasonable, then anyone with a grudge and a convincing enough lie gets to use the police as a weapon. That can't be the standard. It shouldn't be. She played the recording again at the preliminary hearing, and it did what it had done in that first cold room, just louder this time, in front of more people who had the power to do something about it. It turned a police report into a documented setup, and it turned officers responding to a citizen complaint into officers who had never once paused to ask a hard question they easily could have asked. The city did not want a jury anywhere near this. After weeks of quiet, tense negotiation, they came back with a settlement. 6 figures, no formal admission of wrongdoing, but a written apology addressed to Mark by name, acknowledging the events that transpired in language careful enough to have been drafted by 3 different lawyers, which it probably had been. Davies and Miller weren't fired. They were reprimanded, sent through de-escalation and bias training, and returned to active duty within the month. Miller, Mark heard later secondhand through Sarah, had put in for a transfer off patrol not long after. It wasn't much. It also wasn't nothing. That following spring, Mark stood in his kitchen on a Saturday morning listening to Lily narrate, at length and with enormous seriousness, the plot of a cartoon he'd stopped trying to follow. It was an ordinary morning. He noticed himself noticing that, how long it had taken to get back to a version of ordinary that didn't feel like it was being borrowed. He still had the pen. It lived in a drawer now, retired, and some mornings he caught himself glancing at it the way you glance at a smoke detector you're grateful you never had to use twice. Henderson's case never made it to trial. She took a plea a year later, restitution, a suspended sentence, her name attached publicly and permanently to the exact thing she tried to bury under his. Mark didn't feel triumphant when he heard. Mostly he felt tired, in the specific way that comes after carrying something heavy long enough that setting it down doesn't feel like relief so much as absence. This story is fiction. What it's built from isn't. How fast an accusation can outrun the facts, how differently the same he said, she said plays out depending on who's doing the saying, and how much weight a single piece of hard evidence can carry once it exists, if you're lucky enough to have it. Mark had the evidence. Most people, in the moment it matters most, don't. If stories about accountability and about the systems meant to protect people and about what happens when those systems fail, if that's the kind of thing you want more of, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one.